Okay. So right now my mouse enemy characters just disappear when I hit them with the box. And so what we'll do now is replace them with kind of like an explosion particle system. We'll design the particle system first, and then we'll make a script that instantiates the particle system when the box collides with the mouse. And we'll look at, that's another sort of topic that we haven't really talked about, is instantiating items into the scene that don't exist when you create the scene. That can be useful for lots of things, like if you want to add enemies that aren't there at the beginning of the scene, if you want to add projectiles or other elements, then you're going to want to create a scene and then instantiate it in your code. So I'm going to open up a new scene, and I'm going to create my particle system here. So I'm going to create a 3D scene, and I'll just call this particles. Although we do want to give this more of a specific name, so let's call this ghost explosion. Although they're really mouses, but whatever. So let's save this, and we'll save this inside of our components and click save. So first we'll just go over creating the particle system. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, and there's a lot of like little parameters and little things that you can tweak. But one thing that's going to help a lot is if you have a nice texture to start with. You'll see why in a second. So I'm just going to create a really simple texture, but you can also look, if you Google particle texture, you'll see something like this is probably good. You want something that is basically represents one particle. So you wouldn't want something like this where there's lots of dots. You want something that could be used for one specific particle. And so that depends on what type of effect you're going for. This is also kind of a good example. This has a lot of different textures. Particle systems are really useful for all sorts of different things, like smoke and fire, anything that's like a natural thing. This is another good example of like a nice particle to use. It's contained. It's just like represents one particle. It doesn't reach the edges. You don't want it to go out to the edges. And so to do that, I'm just going to create one really quickly in Photoshop, but you can also download them. The Photoshop brushes are pretty useful for this. You can tell just by looking at the other particles why that would be the case. So I'm just going to get a pretty small image size. So I'll do 256 by 256 and just create a particle. I hate it when I accidentally add artboards. Okay. So we're going to want a transparent background, so I'm going to get rid of this background to start. So I'm just going to select everything and hit Command X to cut. And then really you can make whatever you want here. I'm just going to make a brush, and I'll grab, where's my brushes? I'll grab like a random brush, maybe a special effects brush, something like that. And do I not have a let's make sure I have my color set. Okay. Maybe I'll use one of these brushes. Okay, for some reason my brush is not working. Oh, I changed it. Okay. Somehow I switched. Let's just try a general brush. Maybe something like that. Okay. Or maybe one of these would be good. For some reason when I switch to those brushes, my brush stops working. Any Photoshop people know what's going on? Then it goes back to here. It's switching to this like smudge tool. That's weird.
But every time you go...
Yeah, whenever I select a different brush, well, these brushes work, but when I select a wet media brush, it switches to...
Okay, so while you're still selected there, select the brush, see if it changes. Okay.
Yeah, it goes back.
Maybe the wet media brushes might be limited.
Oh, it has like a little smudge logo on it.
Yeah, there we go. So yeah, so what that is, so eraser, this P uses eraser, this P uses smudging, this P
Okay.
Okay, that would make sense. That's a new thing.
Yeah.
I haven't really particularly noticed because I've been just, you know, using Photoshop for so long, and it's little things that like, oh, that's new.
Yeah. Okay, well, we solved that mystery. So I'm going to get this little splatter brush. The size is really high. I'm going to turn that way down. And, okay, that's a little too far down. Something like that. Okay, so now I've got this like little splatter. I want to be careful to not hit any of the edges of the canvas. But I'm basically just going to do something really simple like that just to make a particle. And you can have multiple of these if you want, but I'm just going to do one example. So now I'm going to export as a PNG. We need to use a PNG here so that we have transparency. So let's go to my project and go to textures, and I'll put particle. I'll just put a 1 on there just in case I make more particles later. And so let's see what that looks like. Okay, so there's my particle. So it's pretty simple. You can have like more texture in there if you want, but you're gonna see in a minute why we need a texture for our particle system. Okay, so let's go back to Godot and let's add a particle system. So when I click plus here and I type in particle, you're gonna see there's a few different things that appear. There's CPU particles, there's GPU particles. We're gonna use GPU because they're gonna be a little bit more efficient. But CPU particles could be good if you're making something for mobile or 2D game or something like that. And then there's some other things that we can use within our particle system. This gets more advanced, like collisions and attractors. They kind of add more physics into the particle system. We're not going to go over those right now. We're just going to go over some of the basics. But I'm going to add this GPU particles. And so now we can start designing our particle system. You'll notice that it has a couple warnings, and we don't really see anything. So if you click on this, you're going to see nothing is visible because we haven't assigned a mesh. And then a material, we need a material process. So I'm going to set up a couple basic things, and then we'll go through and set up, go through all of our different properties that we can assign. So we'll just take a look at our particle system. So the first thing we need is something to be assigned to the draw passes. And this is where we can assign basically like either a mesh or an image or whatever we want to be visible in our particle system. And then the main particle material is going to determine a lot of the properties of the particle system. So for the draw passes, we can have multiple passes, so you can have multiple textures or multiple instances or meshes or whatever you want. We're just going to do one. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to do a quad mesh. Quad mesh is basically just like a very simple square mesh, and so it's going to make it easier to render. I don't really need complicated geometry for this. You can add whatever mesh you want, but I'm going to go with the very simple quad mesh. And you can see one thing that you'll notice to start with is that when we first load this quad mesh, you can see the front, but you can't see the back. So that's going to become an issue, but we're going to look at how to fix that. So if we click on this, it's going to open up our mesh properties, and we're going to set a couple things in our material here. So we're going to make a new material, and we're just going to do a standard material. And then we click on that, and we'll open up some material properties. So one of the things that we're going to do to change the way that this renders, and again, this is just an option, you don't have to do this, but if I come down here to billboard, and I turn this enabled, what this does is it makes it so that that quad is always facing the camera. So this means it's always going to look like a square no matter where you're looking at. So it's like a billboard on a highway. It's facing towards the people who are driving through. So this way I don't have to worry about the fact that it's invisible from the other side, and it changes direction and stuff like that. Again, you don't have to do this, but you can. So then we want to go into shading, vertex color. And we want to use the vertex color as the albedo. This is going to allow us to animate the color of our particle using the particle system. So we want to just turn that on. And then for our albedo, in our texture, we're going to throw our particle texture that we created. And we're going to have to turn on alpha for that to work correctly. Okay. Then we might want also to change our blend mode to add. It kind of depends on what you're going for, but the blend mode is going to blend in with whatever's behind the particle. So you might want to do that. We might also, might want to invert this. It's probably going to be easier to use the texture if it's more white than black. So I'm just going to go to invert image and go to invert. Where's that? Right here. Okay. Yeah, this is probably going to work better. You could use either one, but I think this will be a little bit easier. So I'm going to export this. Okay, so now that's going to replace the particle. And so now you see it's nice and bright and glowing. So again, these are just some various settings that we can add. You don't have to do these. You might want to play around with them, but this is going to get us going with our basic particle setup. So we've got one of our particles. So now we can go to our process material and make a new particle process material. So you don't want to do a shader material here. Make sure you do a process material. And now you're going to see our particles are starting to get created. So right now they're just falling straight down because of gravity. We can turn gravity off, but if we want a natural look, we do want to have some gravity. We're going to want to change some of the other parameters to start shooting the particles in different directions. But now that we've got something going, we can see something. Let's go back and look at our different options. So the emitting option is just whether it's emitting particles or not. So emitting just means it's, creating the particles. We can set the amount of particles. So for our explosion, we're probably just going to want a bunch of particles at the beginning, and then, it's just going to end pretty quickly. So we might want to do a big number here. I might do like 128 to start. And it's going to look kind of crazy right now, but we're going to change some of the parameters to make it look better. And then you can also set a sub-emitter. So you can start to get really crazy where you have emitters that are attached to the particles, so you have even more particles coming out of your particles. We're going to keep it relatively simple for now. Okay, so then we have the lifetime of the particle in time. So if we set that to 0, the particle only lasts for 1 frame, and so we really don't see it very much. If you set it to 1 second, it's going to last a little bit longer. I'm going to set this a little bit lower since we have a lot of particles. I'm just going to set this to 0.5. So we're going to get a little bit less time with our particles. We also have the option to make it a one-shot, so it just plays it once. We're going to turn this on later, but for now, it's going to make this hard to test because I'm going to have to click emit every time I want to see it. So we'll turn this on later, maybe in our code. So let's turn this back on. So then we have pre-process will let you add the particles to the scene before the scene starts. We don't need to do that in this case, so I'm going to leave that alone. But that's what that does. Speed scale obviously changes the scale of the speed. If we make this really fast, they're going to go really fast. Explosiveness is how quickly do each particle come out. And so if they're very explosive, they come out very fast. And we can also randomize this a little bit. Probably want to set both of those to 0.5. And then we'll see how that affects things in a second. Everything else in here we're going to leave alone for now, but we may come back. We can also set colliders between the particles. I'm not going to worry about this for now. We're going to ignore drawing. You can set trails, so they have like trails coming off of them. We're going to ignore this for now. Now we're going to get into our process material. And this is where there's a lot of settings. And so you can kind of get lost in here. It's very easy to like have one setting that kind of negates another setting. So it can be kind of tricky. But we'll go over a few basic settings and see if we can get something that looks good. Okay, so first is our spawn. This sets the position, angle, and velocity. I'm going to go into the velocity to start, and I'm going to set the initial velocity higher so it doesn't just fall straight down with gravity. Let's see if we set it to like 5. So now you can see there's this initial velocity that spreads out our particles a little bit more. Okay, and then we can look right now, if we move around, you can see that it's mainly in the x direction because, you know, we have x at 1 and z and y are at 0. So if we want them to go up instead, we can set y to 1 and x to 0. And so now we have this explosion kind of going up. They're all kind of coming from the same point, which is not super realistic, but we'll fix that in a second. So now we see our particles are kind of going up. That looks good. Now the velocity may be a little bit too high. Maybe we'll do like 5. I can't move this thing. It's so annoying when Godot does that. For some reason, I can't always make these windows bigger. There we go. Okay. Okay, so we have initial velocity min and initial velocity max. That's a little bit of a range. Let's set it from 1 to 10, so we'll get a little bit more of a range there. Okay, so that looks good. I might even want more particles now. I'm going to do 256. So this will really be a much more dramatic setting. And then I actually kind of want them to last longer. Let's try 1 second. Okay, that way we get a nice little curve. That's looking kind of good. So let's go back. So then that's the velocity. We can also set the angle. This isn't really going to affect our particle system very much because they're billboards. They're all facing the camera. So if I change the angle, we're not really going to notice any big difference there. But we can change the position, and this is where we can spread out where the particles start from. So the emission shape right now is just a point. So they all start from the middle right here. But if we change this to like a sphere, then there'll be this larger area that we can control of where the particles start from. So that sphere shape, where is that? Oh, it's in here. It's kind of hard to see, but I think it's this. No, where is it? Is it this? Oh, maybe if I increase this, I'll be able to tell. Okay, maybe I actually can't edit it visually, but you can change the size there. And so if we change this to different things, like if I make it a box, you can tell it's a little bit different. It's kind of hard to tell at this point since we have a lot of particles, but we can also do a sphere surface. So this will emit particles from the outside of the sphere, essentially. So if we make that sphere larger, now it kind of looks like they're coming from the outside of the sphere. So you could make your particle system match your enemy a little bit, do different things with that. Okay, so that's the spawn position and velocity. Again, we're going to skip the angle just because we're using billboards. We can animate the velocity, so this is going to change the velocity over time. So if we change the angular velocity over time, if I set this up to like 1, you'll see that they get a little faster over time. If I set it to -1, they're going to get slower over time. I can also do curves for all of these things. So when I do a curve, this is a nice way of just like setting a little bit of a, you know, an ease in or out of a certain value. It's a little subtle to tell here, but this is basically just changing how fast they speed up. If we change the velocity max, this will be a little bit more clear, but it is a subtle difference. We can also change the directional velocity. This is like what direction it's going in, obviously. We can create a curve texture here. This gets kind of complicated, so let's skip this for now. We can also limit the velocity, so we can say they can't go a certain speed. Then we can do kind of crazy stuff with the orbit or radial velocity. So for example, if you want it to go in a circle or something like that, you can do that. But you know, that value is way too high. Let's do like 10. So if I do a radial velocity, you can see there's a little bit of a curve happening as the particles come out. And I can add a curve here and play around with this as well. So you can tell there's really a lot of stuff that you can play with here to get different subtle effects that were going to look more natural in some cases than others. So it kind of depends on what you're going for. Okay, you can change accelerations like gravity. You could turn on damping. This could be helpful if you want the particles to slow down over time. So I could do a damping max of like 2, min of 1, something like that. These will make them slow down a little bit. That could be useful. Bunch of other stuff in here to play with. And then in the display, we can set them to, you know, scale over time. So we could set a scale curve and do something like that. So we're going to get a variety of different sizes of particles. I'll set the scale min to like 0.1. And maybe the max is like 2. So now you're seeing there's some smaller particles, some larger particles. We can change scale over velocity. A fun one is in here. We can do some hue variation. And so this is where we can actually start to change the color. So if we do a curve texture here, let's do... So if I set the variation range a little bit more, you can see we're going to get some different colors here. And then if I set this curve, they're going to start at one color and then gain more colors over time. This kind of looks a little, you know, these are just kind of random colors. So you might want more specific colors here. We could do some color curves here. So we could set a color ramp with a gradient. You can see there's a lot, there's just kind of a crazy amount of stuff that you can do here. But we could set our gradient. We could do some like red colors for an explosion. And then let's turn our hue variation off for a second. Okay. So let's say we have red on one side and let's get rid of this one. And white on the other side. They're going to start more red and then get more white. We could change this to like blue if we want, or something else like that. And let's see. That's our color ramp. And then we could do an emission curve so they get kind of brighter over time. So we can add a little curve in here. It's looking a little goofy, but that's okay. Okay, let's add a little bit of randomness. So if we go to turbulence, we can turn this on. And this is going to add a little bit of noise to how the particles get emitted. So now you can see they're kind of going in a lot of different directions. If we turn this down a little bit, we'll just get a subtle amount of noise. And then we can also change influence over life. So we can do a bunch of stuff with that. And then the collision, we're going to leave that off. Sub-emitter, we're going to leave that off. There's a lot more parameters that we could play with here. So let's make this a little bit faster. I'm going to turn the speed scale to 2. And then I'm going to turn one shot on. So basically, what we want is that animation to play when our enemy disappears. So it looks a little bit like cotton candy right now, which is not necessarily the aesthetic that I want to go for. But just for this example, we'll go with that. I guess it does kind of go with like our weird mouse that we downloaded last week. Okay, anyway, we're gonna instantiate this into a scene. But before we do that, we want a script to control our particles. So we're just gonna do a one-shot. And since we're doing a one-shot, we need to tell the particles to actually emit. So we're gonna put a really simple script on here. I'm gonna grab the main node and add a script. I'm gonna make sure this is in my scripts folder. And we're gonna use an empty template. And basically, we just want our particles to start when they get added to the scene. So we're gonna add a ready function. This is just gonna run once when the scene starts. And I'm just gonna drag these guys over here. And I'm gonna say dot emitting equals true. So that'll just start my particles emitting when the scene starts. So I can use that one shot. So it's gonna just turn this property on, essentially. I'm gonna put another thing in here just to get rid of the particle scene after it's done playing. So I'm gonna do another await here, and I'm gonna await our particles, and I'm just gonna say dot finished. So the particle system has a finished signal, and so if it's set to one shot and we turn it on, we can wait for it to play, and then we're just gonna remove this scene. So we're gonna say cue free. So this basically just gets rid of this scene, so it clears it out of the game memory once the particle system is played. Once it plays once, we don't need to, leave it in there. So we just want to get rid of it. Okay, so I'm just gonna put a note here: start particles and remove particle instance after playing. Okay, so that's our script for our particle system. Now we're gonna go back into our scene and we're gonna add this to our enemy script to play the particle system when it gets hit. So I'm gonna go down to my enemies and open their scene up. And I'm just gonna grab the main enemy here and we're gonna modify their script a little bit. Let's turn this to full screen. Okay, so what we're gonna do here is we're gonna get an instance of our particle system, and when the box or whatever item hits the enemy, we're gonna instantiate a particle system in the position of the enemy, and then when the enemy disappears, there'll be something there. So this is just one way of kind of like reacting to this event, but it's just it's just one example. So I'm gonna use an export here so that I can load that particle system scene. I'm gonna use a variable and call it, what did I call it? Ghost explosion. And I'm gonna set the type to packed scene. So this will load in the scene, and then we'll be able to instantiate it. So then I'm gonna scroll down a bit and find where the hitbox gets hit. So this function down here, on hitbox body entered. We're gonna remove this scene, but before we remove the scene, we're gonna instantiate a new particle system. So I'm gonna say variable, let's just call it GH, or what did I call it? Ghost explosion. Let's call it GE. And then we're gonna say ghost explosion dot instantiate. So we're just gonna make an instance of the ghost explosion. This is like when we link a scene into another scene, but we're doing it through code. And I'm just using GE as a shorthand for ghost explosion. So then we want the explosion to be in the same position as the enemy. So we're gonna say GE.position equals position. So this sets the particle system to the enemy position. I'll put a note here. And then we need to actually add it into the scene. So to get the scene, we're going to say get tree, which gets our scene node. And then we're going to get our main root. So I'm going to say get scene. I kind of forget what this is called. Get scene. Or get roots. No. Get tree slash scene dot scene. Current scene. There we go. Okay, so we're just going to say get tree dot current scene dot add child. So this again is just adding it into the scene hierarchy like we would be doing with the Godot editor, but we're doing it through code. So we're going to add child GE, and I think that's it. So let's see if that works. And we'll just test that. So I'm going to run this scene. And there's my mouse. I'm going to go grab a box. And let's see if I can hit the mouse. I missed it. Okay. Let's try it again. Oh, no, I have an error. So maybe I have an error. Oh, that's just the nav map. That's fine. Okay. Maybe I'll just walk up to the mouse with the box. That might be easier. Uh-oh, I got an error. Oh, I forgot to actually put the particle system in there. Okay, let's go to our ghost instance. And where I added that ghost explosion export variable here, now it's in the editor. I just have to go and load that scene component. So here's my ghost explosion scene. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so now okay, seemed like there was kind of a bit of a delay, so maybe I'll debug that a little bit, but you can see, you know, the guy disappears and we get our little particle system to show us that, you know, we hit the guy. So let's see if I can get this guy. We need to tweak some of the dynamics here. Kind of looked like it was like over there. Anyway, you get the basic idea. I might have to debug a little bit, but that's the basic idea. We can replace our character with an explosion or some other effect. You can use particle systems for a lot of other stuff, like even just like footsteps or any kind of like environmental sort of reactions to different events. Particle systems are good to use for. Okay, so we looked at creating particle systems and we looked at instantiating into our scene on an event. I think that's everything we want to cover. Any questions or anything you guys want to look at or try? What? Well, you would just have to instantiate a particle system like whenever, right now. So for example, in our player scene, we wouldn't be able to see it since it's first person, but our player has this like little footstep timer here, and in the player script, where's the here it is. So when the player is walking, let's let's see. It plays sounds based on the timer. So you could do something similar, but just instantiate particles or particle scenes, at each one of. So each time it says like footstep.play, it plays a sound, but you could also like instantiate a new particle system. So that would create a particle system just like the one that we added to the enemy, but you could position it where the feet are. Obviously, it would work better for like a third-person setup, but you could have that there, so it's like every time they step, you see like some dust or something.
So ultimately, you gotta put particles down to make it
Yeah. You could probably create it through code, but I think that would be very tedious. You could put it in the player scene, but it's easier just to make a separate scene and then instantiate it in the scene that you want to use it in. Any other questions? Okay.